Okay, so folks, hello and welcome to the 34th Annual McDonald Lecture hosted by the Centre for Constitutional Studies here at the University of Alberta. For anyone who doesn't know me, my name is Dr. Richard Maley and I'm the director of the Centre. And it really is an absolute pleasure to be here to introduce a talk that's become a bit of a stalwart in our yearly schedule. And it's also an extra treat to be introducing the wonderful Alain-G Gagnon, who's going to be delivering this year's lecture on the theme of liberal nationalism and multinational federalism. So apologies, first of all, for my croaky voice. I'm just getting over COVID, so bear with me on that front. Just before we get started, I'd like to take a moment to acknowledge the land that I'm speaking from today, which is the University of Alberta campus on Treaty 6 territory. And we, meaning the Centre and I, accordingly acknowledge and honour the ancestors, traditions and spirit that first drew Indigenous peoples, including the Cree, Blackfoot, Métis, Nakota Sioux, Iroquois, Dene, Saulteaux and Inuit to this unique gathering place. And in acknowledging the territory that we're on, we also acknowledge, first of all, that all of us here at the University of Alberta are beneficiaries of treaty. And second, that this thing that I'm doing right now, this land acknowledgement, is only one exceptionally small step in a very large ongoing process of reconciliation in Canada. Now, this event that we're hosting today is an annual lecture that's endowed to the Faculty of Law at the U of A by the family of the late Justice David C. McDonald, who served for many years on the Alberta Court of Queen's Bench. And it's with a sense of the utmost gratitude to them and their consistent generosity that I'd like to open with a few words on Justice McDonald's life and legacy. So Justice McDonald was, like many a great Albertan, actually born in Saskatchewan. And his journey to the bench began with an arts degree right here at the U of A, followed by a stint studying law at Oxford as a Rhodes Scholar. And while Justice McDonald never actually studied law here at the U of A, he was a consistently dedicated friend of the university and of the Faculty of Law in particular. And indeed, he taught here for many years, initially as a full faculty member, and then later as a sessional lecturer while he was in private practice in Edmonton. And just as a testament to how much Justice McDonald gave to our faculty and to how much we appreciate his work, it's worth noting that Justice McDonald is now represented on our Wall of Honour as one of the builders of the U of A Faculty of Law. So we're here today, first and foremost, to honour Justice McDonald's memory and legacy and to express our gratitude for his commitment to our faculty and for the ongoing generosity and commitment of his family as well. So with that said, I'm almost ready to cede the floor, but just before I do, I should say a few words, as always, about how this session will work, just in case some of you haven't done one of these Zoom webinars before. So the drill is the same as always. We'll run this session for about 1 hour, which will include a 30 to 40-minute presentation, and then around 20 minutes or so of audience Q&A. And if you'd like to participate in that Q&A, you can do so by posting your question in the Q&A section of the Zoom interface. That's a little button just at the bottom of your screen. And I'll then pose that question for Professor Gagnon during the Q&A section of the session. Okay, so without further ado then, I'd like to introduce today's wonderful speaker, or rather hand over to someone else who's going to do that job for me. So I'm going to hand over that privilege to Professor Stephen Penny, who is the chair of our Centre's advisory board and a professor of law here at the U of A's law faculty. So thank you very much to you, Stephen, for being here and for doing this. And I will hand over the virtual mic to you.
Thank you very much, Richard. It's my great pleasure and honor to introduce our 34th annual McDonald lecturer, Professor Alain-G Gagnon. And Professor Gagnon is a professor of political science at Université du Québec à Montréal and is the director of a number of research centers, including the Center for Interdisciplinary Research on Diversity and Democracy and the research group on plurinational societies. He's an internationally renowned scholar of federalism and nationalism, both in Canada and elsewhere. And he's especially known for his pioneering comparative research on small and minority nations, and has published a trilogy of books in this area: The Case for Multinational Federalism, published in 2010, Minority Nations in the Age of Uncertainty, published in 2014, and most recently, The Legitimacy Clash, published just the other year, 2022. And this body of work has earned Professor Gagnon an array of honors, including the Governor General's International Award for Canadian Studies in 2016, the Order of Canada in 2019, and the American Political Science Association's Lifetime Academic Achievement Award in 2020. So without further ado, I will turn it over to Professor Gagnon, who will be speaking to us on nationalism under scrutiny, the promises of liberal nationalism, and multinational federalism. Professor Gagnon.
Thank you so much, Stephen Penny, for your very warm welcome. It's extremely appreciated. I wish, obviously, I were in Edmonton today to share my time with you, and also with Richard, mainly, who has introduced today's panel. I have so many connections at University of Alberta. I mean, it goes back to Patricia Paradis, it goes back to Yasmin Aboulaban. Obviously, these colleagues are very close to me, and I wish I were there to be able to spend time and enjoy the cold weather out west today. So perhaps a few comments about what I'm about to say. In fact, I will be probably, in fact, not probably, but surely focusing on three dimensions. I will be looking at the tension between liberalism and nationalism. I will be looking also at what is known as the dark side of nationalism. And ultimately, I will be talking about why we should take very seriously multinationalism, or the plurality of national projects. I think this is, we look at this as a roadmap, and this is, I will try to follow that roadmap. Now, 30 years ago, a colleague of ours, not Yasmin Aboulaban, but Yael Tamir, Yasmin was in my mindset, so Yael Tamir produced an incredible work. I will call it, in fact, a path-breaking book under the title of Liberal Nationalism. And it was the first time that a scholar decided to bring together these concepts of liberalism and nationalism. Most of the time we look at these concepts are being opposite. Now, most of the people would think about liberalism, say, if you're liberal, if you really develop this notion of liberalism, you can't be a nationalist. Well, Tamir, in fact, did demarcate herself by stressing the point that within liberal democracies, the most liberal among them were to be found among liberal nationalist polities. So, in fact, she is of the view that liberalism and nationalism are bound to be working together. And the more liberal a society is, the more, in fact, it could use nationalism as a stepping stone to develop the founding principle of liberalism. Now, in my intervention today, the main point will be that liberal values, or we'll call it cosmopolitanism and nationalism, do not have to enter into conflict or oppose one another. Both of these concepts, nationalism and liberalism, in a sense, are mutually constitutive. They help each other, and they contribute to make a better society to the extent that they are being respected. Now, let me say a few words about the first concept of liberalism, which I link with cosmopolitanism. In fact, it's a very, very polysemantic concept, and for the purpose of my presentation today, I will refer to four main headings. The first one, it is to be considered as a political endeavor beyond the nation-state framework to achieve a global fusion of values. This is the first idea. The second idea is to look at cosmopolitanism as an all-encompassing global project, seeking to bring together individuals in the advent of a much more humane society. The third notion then would be as a linear pattern, moving from the local to the national, to the supranational, to the reordering of the world order around more holistic values such as the development of the community of faith, to borrow from Ulrich Beck. And finally, the fourth dimension is as a political agenda to assist economic interests in imposing themselves at the international level. So my intention then first and foremost is to underline that cosmopolitanism and liberal nationalism represent complementary and concomitant political endeavors. First, my first main heading. In addition, I wish to make the point that liberal nationalism constitutes nothing less than a rooted expression of cosmopolitanism, but that it is simply takes place at the level of a national community where it is possible for the political actors to act and intervene to guarantee the expression of democratic practices. So liberal nationalism entails a commitment to universal ideas and values. In other words, in its liberal embodiment, nationalism is a form of cosmopolitanism. Now, obviously, critics of cosmopolitanism have been prone to denounce its false universalistic pretensions. However, through successive centuries and going as far back as the times of the ancient Greece, the Romans, the Ottomans, and closer to us, the American, advocates of a more cosmopolitan worldview have occupied either a dominant military, dominant political, dominant cultural, or dominant economic position. In other words, cosmopolitanism could also be interpreted as an instrument to perpetuate dominant forms of imperialism and of majority nationalism. So the emergence of the nation state did constitute the beginning of a new era as political communities were seeking the best way to secure peace at the international level. Now, ever since, the two general visions have shared the center stage. A first vision that insisted on the need to establish peace through the imposition of norms at the international level, and an alternate stance that suggested that a peaceful environment can only emerge if communities are protected at the more immediate level. Now, there's been obviously a series of major historical events that from time to time shifted the balance in favor of one of these two conceptions. For instance, in 1948, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights was a cosmopolitan response to the horrors perpetrated in the name of some excessive chauvinistic national ambitions. On the other hand, economic imperialism, under the mantle of human rights and values, constituted another form of abuses and undermined the cosmopolitan project. Now, all in all, we can make the claims that cosmopolitanism and nationalism share the same intellectual foundation, as they both seek to install human rights and dignity, although admittedly through different means and at different scale. However, over the last 20 years, a growing number of political thinkers and philosophers have started to draw attentions to the need for a new concept of cosmopolitanism to get rid of its colonial, imperialistic, and neoliberal connotations. Some authors have started to advance the concept, and this is the one I like a lot, of rooted cosmopolitanism, thus leaning toward the relevance of theories and concepts that built around notions of nationhood, national language, national culture, national identity. And here you can see the connection between my work and the work of David Miller on his famous book on nationality. Now, this theoretical move has installed a new life into the concept of nationalism, interpreted as an expression of the political will through the advent of loyalty, community, solidarity, justice, and also the emergence of multiple contexts of choice under the mantle of diverse societal cultures. Now, it's worth returning here to, and I was referring to the concept of societal culture, which I borrow from Will Kimlicka. It's important to return to Will's work, as he invested so much intellectual energy in discussing the role of culture, but especially the importance it has for national minorities, wishing that their cultural membership remains very strong. Culture constitute concrete context of choice. Culture, according to Will Kimlicka, provides option, and it provides an anchor for self-determination and the safety of effortless, secured belonging, end of quote. Now, the full expression of culture then should lead to the institutionalization of group rights. This can be expressed differently in Western liberal democracy, according to a variety of state traditions that have been adopted and adapted over the years. Now, in a book I co-edited with my colleague José Maria Sauca, Isabelle Vence-Simon made a particularly rich contribution when she discussed the need for a deliberative ideal, a principle well-rooted in the Republican tradition, as well as the need for a more participatory citizenship. This, according to Vence, will have three main repercussions. First, to debate the future of majority and minority culture. Second, to discuss and reach agreements about the conditions of coexistence. And finally, to find the means for coexistence between distinct and at times covert identities. Now, with respect to point one that is raised by my colleague Isabelle Vence, it is important to know that both majority and minority culture can stand up for human rights and can advance democratic project. Size here doesn't matter so much. What matters are the state tradition upon which communities are constructed. For instance, a majority nation that is willing to institutionalize power relations that are respectful of pactism or that stands up for shared role will be able to escape the danger associated with the almighty state, or, as I put it in my work, of the all-encompassing state. With respect to her point, a second point made by Vence, this refers to the capacity of state actors to make institutions sensitive to a culture founded on ongoing negotiation rather than on an imposed political order that cannot be changed due to the rigidity of constitutional arrangements. I don't need to remind you that Albertans know a lot about this condition where it is very difficult to make changes to the constitutional arrangement because they are very rigid. In the country case, I know obviously best Canada, that is the 1982 patriation that has been a key moment. It was a key moment to revisit our federal arrangement in light of maturing Aboriginal and Quebec national claims. But rather than recognizing those legitimate claims, the overall reaction was to oppose it. Instead, we saw political actors rallying around Canada's majority national project with a view to place the national reality of Quebec or the Aboriginal under a pan-Canadian, and I stress here the word, juridical nationalism. It is this inflexibility I advance, along with the weakening of federal practices in Canada, that led Quebecers to question and even reconsidered their ties with the Canadian polity. This brings me to Isabelle Vance's third and last point, the identification and adoption of mechanisms capable of recognizing and bringing together political communities. In other words, how to build bridges between political communities, how to make sure that those communities do not simply act as if they were evolving in silos. What we have witnessed in many cases during the last 4 decades has been a weakening of the central state capacity to respond positively to the circumstances of national pluralism, concomitant with a shrinking or even a denial of self-rule. Here I feel my work, as well as the work of colleagues such as Stephen Tierney, Michael Keating on multinational and plurinational states, can assist in bringing into the conversation both national pluralism as well as the desires for citizens to belong to more than one political community. And here, obviously, this is all of my work during the last 2 decades in particular, and the triptych that has been referred to earlier by Stephen. This is where I connect my effort in trying to make sure that national pluralism and the place and role for citizens is taken seriously by political actors. I said there were 2 sections to my talk. The second section is about the dark side that nationalism has often been portrayed with. What has become clear over the time for many students of liberalism is that nationalism, majority or minority nationalism for this matter, does not have to be conceived from a dark side. That is, as a conservative, reactionary, chauvinist, or racist expression. In this vein, the American political scientist Craig Calhoun is obviously very important for us. He says that of passionate excess or successful manipulation by demagogues, this is not how we ought to look at nationalism. Nationalism offers, according to Craig Calhoun, both a mode of access to global affairs and a mode of resistance to aspects of globalization. It has the 2 capacity, the 2 ingredients that are quite essential. To wish it away, Calhoun mentions, is more likely to invite the dominance of neoliberal capitalism than to usher in an era of world citizenship, end of quote. We now find ourselves in an age of great uncertainty. This age is defined by the creation of a global market and economic standardization. It is also characterized by a rising wave of cultural Americanization. It is also characterized by the decline of political literacy and civic engagement. It is also characterized by a growing uniformity between formally distinct societies and culture, and by the continuing atomization of the individual. Now, taken together, these phenomena constitute an unprecedented threat to the survival of minority cultures, to the survival of minorities' identity, to the survival of national projects. Thus, there is a pressing need for minority groups to reassert themselves and to use an expression that colleagues from the Aboriginal communities are using, to resist the homogenizing imperative of this age of uncertainty. It is within this new context of the advent of liberal nationalism that I have attempted to demonstrate how multinational polities can most effectively affirm diversity and respond to the claims of minority nations, much more than would be the case under an unachievable cosmopolitan project. To illustrate my point, I will hark back to my book entitled Minority Nation in the Age of Uncertainty, New Paths to National Emancipation and Empowerment. Since its inception, Canada has had to address very tough issues. We all agree, we all understand this. And as such, the Canadian case provides an informative account of the manner in which minority and majority nations have been engaged in an evolving institutional and ideational dialogue. In turn, I will attempt to elicit from this particular context broader lessons that may be applied both to other federal polities and states undergoing the process of federalization. I will also link the Canadian case with the Spanish situation. A brief examination of these two polities provides a new launching point from which I hope to construct a model for the continuing survival and advancement of minority nations. In doing so, I will, building on my work, I will sketch the principles that are vital to ensure that national minorities and national majorities coexist under the auspices of just and fair intercommunal relation, and through which minority nation can fulfill their legitimate and democratic aspiration. This is, in a nutshell, the work I've been doing in the most recent segment, in the last segment of the triptych, The Clash of Legitimacy. The relationship between international organization and national minorities underwent a very significant transformation during the last 2.5 decades. Instead of promoting the rights of national minorities as they once did, international organizations tend more and more to focus on protecting the rights of individuals within minority nations. Now, to be clear, the plight of the national minorities, let's say in the case of Kosovo or East Timor, has been brought to public attention thanks to pressure coming from the international organization themselves. These cases represent exception to a developing trend that has taken hold at the supranational level. Instead, we've been witnessing a gradual shrinking of the recognition of national minorities. Now, this development is perhaps best captured in the 2004 United Nations Development Program report on human development, bearing the title of Cultural Liberty in Today's Diverse World. To ensure the long-term survival, national minorities must overcome a major hurdle. National majorities have historically downplayed or ignored national minority claims under the pretext that if it were to be done, this will have two major consequences. The first one would be to undermine the country's presence in international organization. The second one, that has been raised and frequently formulated, it will weaken the country's position in the world's economy. Now, confronted with threats emanating from minority groups, representative of the all-encompassing state have demanded the unquestioned loyalty of national minorities. However, within the context of unfettered cultural and economic globalization, the dual threat of cultural erosion and declining international relevance is potentially far more devastating for minority nations. These nations must not only counteract the homogenizing forces of globalization, they must also resist the pressure of cultural uniformity generated from within their own state. Aboriginal people in Canada are the ones that are clearly most affected by these global phenomena. The loyalty and unity that national majorities demand of national minorities cannot be accepted unless it is also reflected by the adoption of commensurate measures meant to ensure the advancement of liberty, freedom, justice, fairness, and democracy within multinational polities. In other words, conditional trust should be the part of the equation, should be in fact the main part of the equation. Blind trust is a concept that belongs to another era. In the following segments, I will offer my own take on how liberty, diversity, and unity can be reconciled in this age of uncertainty. In turn, I hope to outline the contours of a new political project for multinational states that is rooted in the ideals of liberty, the ideals of recognition, and the ideal of empowerment. I contend that a political project based on these ideals will open new vistas for minorities and majority nations to engage in a frank and honest dialogue, and will allow for the mutual and compatible coexistence of difference of trust and liberal nationalism, or what I called a bit earlier, anchored cosmopolitanism within the concept of modern liberal democracies. However, the adoption of this new project is not to be taken for granted. It requires that minority nations follow the path laid before them by indigenous movement, and in turn resist with the determination those that seeks to maintain the status quo and to maintain the power disequilibrium. Now, the enshrinement of a new political project for multinational politics requires cultivating three principles: the principle of moderation, the principle of dignity, the principle of hospitality. These three principles are the fibers that, when sewn together, create the canvas of a political base on liberty, of recognition, and of empowerment. Now, a few words about the principle, and I know the time is escaping me, the principle of moderation. Here I go back to Montesquieu's excursus on creating balance in political society. For him, it provides, in fact, this idea of balance. It provides, and for me, it provides the very first principle. In the 19th century, Montesquieu argued both for the separation of legislative, executive, and judicial power, and for the unrelenting pursuit of diversity. He wanted all of these ingredients be put together and find a fair balance. The notion of balance, which underlies these objectives, is vital for the entrenchment of a new politics within the context of this age of uncertainty. Balance, according to Montesquieu, is a necessary buttress against the development of autocratic, totalitarian, tyrannical systems of government. As such, the entrenchment of balance and good government via the separation of power and the pursuit of diversity requires that political ambition and intentions be tempered or moderated. History, however, is rife with countless instances where political actors have defied the principle of moderation and instead attempted to impose their will on constituent and political subjects. The First Nations of the New World have paid the price for the unfettered ambition of colonial power. The current situation in Gaza and the West Bank speaks volume to these worst conditions. Too many times, minority nations have been subject to the creation of structures of domination. This is most readily brought to light within the Canadian context by a lot of work that I've done. I will call them landmark work done by Josh Nichols, Geneviève Notens, Joseph Yvon Thériault, at the University of Victoria, James Tully, which document the process of cultural, religious, linguistic homogenization that the First Nation, Francophone Quebecers, and Acadian have had to resist since the foundation of the Canadian state. That takes me to the second principle, the principle of dignity that I was referring to a few moments ago. Other thinkers have focused on the human nature and the necessary condition for the creation of a just society. Obviously, people like David Hume, 18th century, John Rawls, the 1970s, 1980s, in particular, have addressed the need to design rules that lead to and sustain justice. While the rhetoric of dignity is no longer a core component of majority and minority interaction in Canada, because it looks like we are acting as, I would say, normally in a quite decent way, it is still central to the persistent internal conflict in some other polities. In recent years, and this is my chance here to refer to Spain, Spain has seen a growing conflict between state nationalist forces and sub-state national movement. In the Basque Country, in Catalonia, in Galicia, the nature of this conflict was effectively very well captured by an editorial published at the moment of the failed revised Statute of Autonomy in 2009. The editorial strikes at the heart of the conflict between the Bourbon-style nationalists and advocates of multinational federalism. To quote briefly this editorial, it says, the foundational pact that has allowed Spain to prosper over the last 30 years is now being questioned. At this time, it is best to remember one of the founding and essential principles drawn from ancient Rome that underlies our legal system. Pacta sunt servanda. Agreement must be respected. End of quote. Now, Catalonia, the editorial continues, is in the grips of a real fear, and it is necessary for all of Spain to recognize this. Catalan fear above all a loss of dignity. End of quote. Now, these two excerpts reveal that majority and minority relation could very well be at a turning point. Whether it is in Catalonia, in Scotland, or in contexts where national minorities have engaged in similar political projects, the pursuit of dignity has become the rallying cry for the re-entrenchment of democracy, or at least to halt the degeneration of democracy. In Spain, demands for the enshrinement of dignity have oftentimes fallen on deaf ears. In such a context, dignity is inextricably linked to the recognition of national diversity. And I don't imagine, unfortunately, the day it will take place that it will be returned, it will be given to the Catalan people. The third and last principle, the principle of hospitality. I mentioned when I refer to the first principle, which required that national majority embrace moderation and embrace respect for national dignity. The third principle, and probably the most, at least from my perspective, the most important one, underlies the creation of a decent political relationship between national groups. It requires that national minorities themselves adopt an ethic of hospitality. The principle of hospitality is meant to provide additional context of choice and acts as a means to counteract the atomizing effect of procedural liberalism. My colleague Daniel Innerarity has devoted an entire book to the idea of an ethic of hospitality. According to Daniel Innerarity, adopting hospitality as a prime imperative permit, and I quote Daniel, permit to appropriate an interpretive approach for understanding the rich strangeness of life, the ways of others, the often opaque and hostile cultural context that we find ourselves immersed in, and that nonetheless drives us to seek out what is new, to enter into contact with what is different, and to seek out harmony, end of quote. Now, this way of understanding reality casts new lights on the political world and gives primacy to a good life rooted in society and intercommunal relations, a philosophy which rests on the principle of reciprocity as well. Now, this principle of hospitality will undoubtedly lead to deliberation and to periods of tensions. However, our mature, and I stress mature, democratic society must embrace a certain degree of uncertainty and accordingly must be open to the possibility of change, of transformation from within and perhaps from without. It is only through intercommunal interaction that a modern society can implement a political project that listens to all voices and that encourages political participation within and across communities. Minority nations, even more so than majority nations, must therefore embrace this ethic of hospitality. They must address a series of challenges entailing inter alia, the accommodation and welcoming of migrant populations. Here, this is a message also to Quebec, maintaining the predominance of majority languages in various regions, addressing the disappearance of a sense of community, counteracting citizen disengagement, and moderating the cultural and economic impact of globalization. When confronted with these phenomena, minority nations are obviously at risk. As such, they must find new ways of sustaining mobilization, new ways to be active members, active citizens, both internally and obviously externally. Now, this principle of hospitality requires the adoption of a genuine politics of interculturalism. I've started working on this concept more recently with Arjun Tremblay from the University of Regina. We're trying to give deeper meaning to this notion. And I think there is a lot of potential for this notion of interculturalism. The intercultural model allows for the healthy dialogue between the constituent members of a diverse society, and in turn for the articulation of an authentic pact between groups. This model also allows, on the one hand, for the continued cultural and ideational diversification of the national minorities, and on the other, it provides an opportunity for the national minority to exist and thrive over time. I'm getting to almost to the concluding point here. While intercommunal dialogue may lead to the voicing of profound ideological disagreement, interculturalism is a necessary mechanism for ensuring the survival and democratic evolution of minority nations. Now, to conclude, as a student of nationalism, and as well, let's face it, a student of federalism, I'm working on these two ideas, I feel comforted today that we are capable of discussing values that bring together both nationalism and liberalism. This should contribute to feed a genuine dialogue between promoters of these two perspectives that until very recently were evolving in opposite camps. In brief, anchored cosmopolitanism has the potential to bring together two fields of research that have for too long ignored and denounced each other as being either too narrow-minded and selfish, or else as being ruthless, free-floating, and blind. Thanks.
Alain, thanks so much for that. I wish that we were all there in person so that we could give you the round of applause that you deserve. Hopefully it'll suffice for me just to express gratitude on behalf of everyone here for that really richly illuminating and thought-provoking address. So now that brings us to the part of the session where we get to open up a line of communication between you and the audience. So if you have a question for Professor Gagnon, please use the Q&A button just at the bottom of the Zoom interface to type it out, and I'll then relay as many of your questions as I can before the end of the session. I see we've got two already in the Q&A, so let me get started. The first question is, to whom are you referring when you speak of Canadian minority nations? Is this Quebecers, Indigenous peoples, or the many, many immigrants in Canada who are here and who are coming in greater numbers?
It's a very good question. Look, I'm looking at self-defined national community. Now, obviously, the immigrant component, to my understanding, at this point, are not yet defining themselves as self-determining political subject. Whereas Aboriginal, Acadian, Quebecers, Canadian as a totality are self-defining themselves as political subject. So it's not a lack of respect for all of the immigrant population, but obviously they are coming into a multinational political setting. They are contributing to making it brighter, more open to the world, more sensitive to other political traditions. They have a major contribution to make, and obviously we will not be as motivated and inspired society if they weren't there. But it's not an issue of migrant issue. This is an issue of self-determining political community, self-defining political community. The day that, let's say, the Chinese Canadian will start to define themselves as a political subject because of the number, because of the tradition, well, then we will have to reconsider the way that we look at things. And here the notion that my colleague Michael Keating is putting forward between the multinational and the plurinational is that a singular person, an individual, can in fact adhere to a multiplicity of nations within a multinational setting. So you could be an Anishinaabe also identifying as a Quebecer and as a Canadian. There's nothing wrong with it. It's you as an individual who decides how you want to, what are the view you want to present and share with the community. So you could see it as institutionally bound political subject, or you as an individual having a multiplicity of national identity. And for me, obviously, Canada is a multinational polity, not a singular national community. So the notion of state and nation here are quite distinct. We have a singular state, but within the multiplicity of national bonding agency.
So our next question here comes from Ian Peach, and the question is this: bridge building would seem to demand engagement, conversation, and exchange. Is a commitment to bridge building and the necessary engagement, conversation, and exchange, therefore, an imperative of liberalism, a fundamental principle of liberal democratic constitutionalism, at least in a multinational state? If you see it as so, when is that imperative triggered?
Okay, well, thank you, Ian Peach, for your question. This is major question, in fact, this idea of engaging with one another. In fact, it's the notion of citizenship that is behind this. And oftentimes, I listen to colleagues who are writing about nationalism, federalism in Canada, and oftentimes, oh, well, the Quebec question, it's all settled now. It's all behind us now. There's no one asking for trying to move forward with this notion of secession. But I have to admit that these times, these very, very, very challenging times, were probably, in a sense, the most interesting and inspiring moment, because Quebecers and Canadian outside of Quebec, we'll put it this way for simplicity, they were engaging with one another. They were debating, they were, in fact, sharing a citizenship. They were sharing, debating a community vision. And oftentimes people, obviously, they disagree or agree to disagree, but this, in a sense, is a major step forward in understanding the other position. Now, Laforest speaks about putting each other in each other's shoes to understand the position of the other. But what concerns me today is that these exchanges, these high tension debates are no longer taking place. But it doesn't mean that we have a stronger country. I would say to the opposite. We're building a country in which we're turning our back on each other. And we're building from within instead of trying to reach out, even if at times it's poorly made and there are mistakes. But the idea of being able to engage with one another, to confront vision, this makes a stronger country in the end, instead of ignoring one another and pretending the other doesn't matter. Now, my sense is that we have lost a lot during the last 2 decades in particular, with this idea that we're not even re-engaging constitutionally. It's as if, but if we're not re-engaging, it's because our society, political society, is shrinking. I'm not saying it's dying, it's not dying, but it's shrinking and it's being impoverished. I hope I answered to Ian's speech question correctly.
But I think very much so. And if I can tack an extra question onto the end of that, because I agree, I think it's a terrible shame that we've lapsed over the last sort of 30 years into this prolonged stretch of constitutional rigidity, despite this ongoing deep dissatisfaction with the status quo. But I suppose I want to ask about the opposite problem or risk that you find really discussed really well by folks like Andrew Arato, and that's the risk that in combating constitutional rigidity through open dialogue, which is good, you can easily lapse into constitutional instability, where the Constitution is perpetually up for grabs and ceases to have the kind of minimal, like, lodestar function that you might want it to have. So I guess my question is, how do we combat constitutional rigidity, but then ensure that this doesn't slide into constitutional instability and perpetual constitutional politicking?
Well, obviously, rigidities, constitutions are, they are in and of themselves, they are rigid, So we have to find ways, which I would call, the British call abeyances. We have to give added life to this notion of abeyances, this notion of pact, agree that the political world is not just limited by the constitutional setting. There has to be space where we can agree on a variety of things, and perhaps turn, not have a legalistic vision You know, I was referring to the case of Catalonia. This my colleague Jorge Caguiago Iconde, who just released an incredible book about patriotas con toga. No, those are patriot, you know, that simply carry the juridical nationalism. So the lawyer and the Supreme Court simply determine. They simply determine the political course. This is inadmissible. You know, the courts are there to give feedback, but again, the politicians are there to allow for this political space to be broadened, not to shrink the political space. This is the only place where we have reasonable freedom. So we need to be able to engage into a conversation. We need to be able to engage into reasonable disagreement. You know, we're not talking about here, yes, let's celebrate anarchy. This is not what I'm saying here. But let's celebrate diversity, difference, and let's make sure that the politicians are mature enough to allow for this to take place. Instead of simply say, well, no, we're not going to enter into constitutional debate because it's going to create tension. Well, life is about tension, but we need to be reasonable about these tensions so that we accommodate in the best possible way legitimate claims made in the political spheres.
Thank you for letting me abuse my position of moderator for a moment. We do have a few more questions to get through if you have an extra 5 minutes or so.
I'm okay.
So the first one is minority nations are at risk. What if we don't want to participate in new ways of sustaining globalization as Indigenous peoples? I'm Indigenous, and are you speaking in capitalistic forms when you talk about global economics?
Yes, it's a very, very pointed question. Yes, I'm speaking about the capitalistic forms. But in a sense, I was mentioning, and I insisted very much on this anchored cosmopolitanism. It's not because you're acting locally that you not have a worldview. And I think the First Nations here are an extremely important model for us because they don't need to be wanting to reach out and possessing everything. It's not that. It's that as a community, as a group, you can have world values that have universal advantages, and we have to learn from this. So I'm trying to, I think the First Nations are showing us the way in this anchored cosmopolitanism I was referring to, and this could be based, let's say, within the community of Maliotenam. It could be based in another community. It's not because it is locally formulated that it will not have an international reach.
So we have, well, actually, fortunately, one of the questions is a comment. So the commenter says, I'd like to thank Alain for his very rich and illuminating presentation, especially in our current times of conflict, a much needed and brilliant analysis for further discussion. The final question then is, what is the role of the majority in this model? As minority nations stand up and find new ways of participating and contributing, this may affect or alter the national identity. How do we ensure the majority is flexible enough to accommodate this shift?
Mm-hmm. Well, and I was very careful when I spoke toward the end. In particular, I said we need to have an ethics of hospitality. The ethic of hospitality I referred to, it's very much constructed on the obligation minority nations have toward everyone. So the minority nations are also there to invite, bring in, associate, work with. So they need to be the most hospitable minority nations. And this is something I'm addressing also to all Quebecers. They need to be welcoming of whatever visions one has and whatever disagreement one might have. They need to be as open, access, willing to be transformed as well. And at the same time, well, there's a majority nation. So the majority nation needs to be generous. You know, it starts from this. But, and if the minority nations are capable of accommodating, welcoming, obviously it builds a better society. And we need to be able to accept that we have a multiplicity of national vision. And this is what ought to be accommodated. And if we're capable of doing that, our country is going to be much, much more stronger. It's done through respect, through moderation, through dignity. These are the most important principles, and the notion of hospitality brings it all together.
Well, unfortunately, that's all that we have time for today. I could listen for much longer, but I do want to take a few moments just to say some very deserved thank yous to some folks who made this event possible. So a huge thank you again, first of all, to the late Justice McDonald and his family for making this lecture possible and for funding it for so many years. A huge thank you, of course, to Professor Gagnon for giving us such a brilliant, insightful lecture on such an important and timely topic. A huge thank you to Stephen Penny for representing the Centre's board today and for introducing Professor Gagnon. And a huge thank you, finally, to our Centre's other staff members, Julie and Aubrey, for all of their work behind the scenes for this event and for all of our events to make sure that they go off without a hitch. So as ever, if you enjoyed today's webinar, you can go to our website, constitutionalstudies.ca, for more, hopefully, great content, including podcasts and videos and much more. Or you can visit us on many, many social media sites. That includes Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, LinkedIn, YouTube, and now even Blue Sky, although I don't think we or anyone else has a clear sense yet of how to use Blue Sky. So anyway, thank you again to everyone for joining us. Thank you for all of your interest and all of your questions, and we'll hopefully see you again very soon for our next webinar. So stay safe, and if you're in Edmonton, stay warm, and we'll see you very soon. Thank you again to Alain.
Thank you, everyone. Appreciate it.